Egusa shook Fuchida's hand. "Whoa! Congratulations, Commander!" Fuchida took the paper and slid it back into his folder, snapping it shut. As a career military man, he obeyed his orders, but he didn't like working without a clear objective. He was uneasy. He leaned closer to Egusa. All of the very best airmen have been brought together on these southern bases, so many swords being sharpened, but no plan for battle. September 5th, 1941. The Imperial Palace, Tokyo. In the evening, Emperor Hirohito held a final briefing in his office, standing with General Sugiyama, his 61-year-old Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Nagano, Chief of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff, and Prime Minister Konoe. With an impending Imperial Conference the next morning to discuss the decision of war with the United States, everyone wanted the decision to be clear beforehand. The Emperor, in his impeccable black suit, spoke to Sugiyama. "In the event we must finally open hostilities, will our operations have a probability of victory?" "Yes, Your Majesty, they will," he calmly replied, while nodding his head downward. "And can you carry out the southern operations as planned?" "I believe so." Hirohito's voice began to rise. "At the time of the Roko Bridge incident in China, the army told me that we could achieve peace immediately after dealing them one blow with 3 divisions, and that Chiang Kai-shek would give up right away. That was 4 years ago. You were army minister at that time." Holding his gaze downward, the old general answered, "Your Majesty, China is a vast area with many ways in and many ways out, and we met unexpectedly large difficulties." "You say the interior of China is vast? Isn't the Pacific Ocean even bigger than China? Didn't I caution you each time about those matters? Sugiyama, are you lying to me?" All were stunned at the extraordinary outbreak of emotion from the Emperor, his face red with anger. He turned and paced away. Lifting his head, Sugiyama responded, "If we waste time, let the days pass, and are forced to fight after it is too late, then we won't be able to do a thing about it." "All right, I understand." The Emperor collected himself as he stood near a tall window draped with burgundy curtains, and sighed hard as he looked out into the unknown blackness. Konoe raised his voice. "Your Majesty, shall I make changes in tomorrow's agenda? How would you like me to go about it?" The Emperor continued to stare into the night, his white-gloved hands behind his back. Konoe was appearing weaker every day, leaning toward negotiations, while Sugiyama and Nagano looked stronger. Negotiate and wait? Wait for what? Time was running out. There is no need to change anything. The following morning, in the formal council chamber, the meeting of the cabinet went on as planned. Emperor Hirohito weighed the arguments while listening to a wide-ranging discussion on all of the possibilities and considerations of expanding the war into Southeast Asia, or the Southern Operation as it was called, the complications if the Soviet Union attacked from the north, and a possible war with the United States. General Sugiyama held the floor. The United States will not be able to be defeated. However, with success in the Southern Operation, Great Britain will be crushed, producing a great change in American public opinion. Therefore, a favourable conclusion to the war is not necessarily beyond hope. We must develop the rich resources of the southern area and utilize the economic power of the East Asian continent in order to establish a durable, self-sufficient economic position. We will continue to work with Germany and Italy to break up the unity of the United States and Britain. Linking the victories in Europe with our victories in Asia will produce an advantageous situation for us. In this way, we could hope to come out of the war somewhere, even with the United States. The general, his chest covered with medals, bowed, then stood upright and took his seat. On his raised platform, the Emperor held a report in his hands. Regarding this outline for carrying out the national policies of the Empire, having listened to everything said today, I ask that you would continue to complete all preparations for war with the United States, Britain and the Netherlands, and to be prepared to come to a final decision on war by the end of October. At the same time, I want it to be clearly understood that I want full cooperation for diplomatic negotiations for a settlement, if it is at all possible. Head nodded around the room, but Hirohito knew most of their minds were made up. The Emperor laid the sheet gently onto the desk before him and reached into his breast pocket to retrieve a small piece of worn paper which he carefully unfolded. It was a well-known tanka, an ancient form of Japanese poetry, written by Emperor Meiji in 1904, at the uncertain outset of the Russo-Japanese War, a war in which Japan was ultimately victorious. Emperor Meiji was Hirohito's grandfather. Adjusting his glasses, he read the words solemnly. "Across the 4 seas, all are brothers." In such a world, why do the waves rage, the winds roar? The room was dead silent. All wanted to confidently predict the future, and even more, to assure it, but Hirohito knew that these were things no one could possibly know, least of all himself. He looked up with gravity, briefly glanced at a few faces, carefully folded the poem, and slowly slid it back into his pocket without a further word. 1941. Keuka College, just outside Rochester, New York. With a cream-coloured sweater wrapped over her shoulders, sleeves tied across her chest, Peggy clutched her books as she crossed the grassy campus with her roommate Jean, a slightly stout girl in a long plaid skirt. "Music major," Jean said. "Been playing piano since I was 6. What about you?" The changing leaves set off the claret brick of the main building behind them as they headed toward the lake in the autumn air. Peggy looked up at a tree, then let her eyes wander across the clouded sky. "Sociology, I think." "Why's that? Sounds hard." "I don't know. I guess I just like working with people." Just then, a small flock of mallards descended on the lake and skidded across the water to a stop. "Hey, good timing. I brought some bread to feed the ducks. Come on, let's go." "The hunters'll love us for fattening up the ducks." Peggy looked back sternly. "Well, these ducks are heading south for the winter." September 1941. Kagoshima Air Base, the island of Kyushu, southern Japan. 3 engineers in white struggled with an 18-foot Type 91 torpedo on its cart below a green Nakajima bomber as another plane taxied past a long line of aircraft. In his office, stacked with books and papers, Fuchida compared a textbook to his written notes in preparation for another class. An orderly tapped on his open door, but Fuchida didn't look up. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Genda is here to see you." Fuchida could hardly believe his old friend was at the Kanoya base and excitedly rose just as Genda entered, smiling broadly. They shook hands and grabbed one another's upper sleeve in a military embrace. "Genda, where have you been hiding? It's been too long, but I've been busy." Genda tossed his hat on top of a filing cabinet. "So have I, but neither of us is as busy as we'll soon be." All the months of training and the mysterious gathering of pilots had aroused a lot of curiosity among the flyers, but none more than Fuchida. He knew there were a lot of places they could be heading, from northern China to Indochina, but he was prepared, and far more than merely curious. "I'm listening." As he lit a match, Genda motioned for Fuchida to have a seat. Then he put the flame to his cigarette and waved the match out. "I've been in nothing but meetings for the last few months." He strolled over to a sweeping map centered on the Pacific Ocean on Fuchida's wall, taking his time to survey it from side to side, his hands on his hips. Various notes were pinned around the edges, and small rising sun flag pins marked territories of Japan, as did Chinese and American flag pins in other places in East Asia and the Pacific. Fuchida knew this would be no ordinary conversation. "When Germany conquered France, we gained free access to what was French Indochina here," Genda said, pointing to a rising sun flag pin on the coast below mainland China, "putting us in a better position to fight the Chinese, to obtain rich supplies of rice, and enabling us to later drive south to Malaya, giving us access to essential tin and rubber. The colony of Indochina will soon be reorganized to assure a steady flow of rice at controlled prices. He glanced at Fuchida to see if he was following. At the same time, the US continues to give us ultimatums to abandon Manchukuo. He swung his finger up north. Fuchida rose and continued Genda's point. Which is impossible. We need the natural resources. We've spent too many lives for it, and we'll never accept orders from another nation like America. Fuchida knew it would be a national disgrace, after urging the nation on year after year, to then give it all up and bow to the wishes of America. The demands were insulting. Genda turned to Fuchida and continued. The US continues to strangle us. First, they cut off high-octane aviation fuel, then high-grade scrap iron, then all iron and copper, and then all oil. Then they froze all assets. Fuchida folded his arms. He knew all this, but wasn't sure where Genda was going. You don't need to tell me. I have a hard enough time getting gas for my own car. But more oil could be available to us in the Dutch East Indies if we expanded further south. Genda took a long puff on his cigarette and looked at Fuchida from the side of his eyes. You'd be interested to know that the Germans gave us captured mail from a steamer headed for Singapore, which included a letter from the British cabinet to the Singapore government, the bastion of military power in the area. Genda paused. The British said that they are completely unable to defend Singapore and can send no fleet to her aid. None. It's wide open. At this, Fuchida raised his hand and shook his head. But if we launch into the East Indies, the American fleet would immediately sortie to attack and cut us off using the Philippines as a base. The US had been slowly building up strength in the Philippines for this very reason, and Fuchida knew it. So the best battle plan is to cut the sword from our opponent's belt before he can ever draw it. Genda looked at Fuchida's puzzled face for a moment, then plucked a rising sun flag pin from the edge of the map and planted it on Oahu, Hawaii. Fuchida's eyes widened. Yamamoto plans to attack Pearl Harbor. We will completely destroy the American fleet before it's ever deployed. Pearl Harbor? Are you out of your mind? That's the stronghold of the US fleet. Exactly, Genda said as he calmly picked up a set of rising sun flags and began removing the flags of other nations following his explanation. At the same time, we'll simultaneously attack Hong Kong, Indochina, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Wake Island and Guam, then seize the Dutch Indies with her oil, making them all a part of Greater East Asia. America will be paralyzed and Australia and New Zealand will be isolated. Fuchida's mind reeled as he ran his hands through his hair and studied the new layout. In all of his many imaginations, the thought of attacking Hawaii had never seriously crossed his mind. He folded his arms. He could only stare in disbelief as he began taking it all in while searching for the weaknesses of the plan. His eyes penetrated every new flag on the map. That would take months of preparation and planning. What do you think you've been doing down here all this time? Genda plucked US flags from the Philippines, Wake Island and Guam. What do you think I've been doing all this time? He plucked British flags from Hong Kong, Malaya and Singapore, Dutch flags from the East Indies, Sumatra and Java, and Australian flags from New Guinea, replacing them all with Japanese flags. From Japan to Hawaii and back, that's a round trip of over 8,000 miles, beyond the limits of our longest-range ships. And besides, how could such a huge fleet travel so far, completely undetected by the Americans? It doesn't seem possible. We'll refuel on the open seas. Reaching back to the map and leaning down, he swept his hand below Hawaii. The Americans are scouting south and west, so we'll approach from due north. He looked Fuchida in the eyes. Admiral Yamamoto has insisted on the absolute need for a surprise aerial assault, and that we must act swiftly and decisively. The attack will be extremely difficult but not impossible, so I recommended you for the job. and Yamamoto himself agreed. He wants you to command the combined squadrons of the carrier fleet. The American battleships are Yamamoto's primary targets, but I want to take out as many carriers as well. With the Pacific Fleet out of the way, they'll be forced to negotiate terms favourable to Japan. Genda jabbed the British and American flags onto the fringe of the map. Does Yamamoto plan to take Hawaii as well? No, we wouldn't have the resources with the southern operation in full swing. The US doesn't want war with Japan, and we don't want war with them. Hitler conquered America's old friends, and Roosevelt did nothing. We're willing to bleed and die for our emperor, but all they care about is baseball and jazz music. Sink their fleet, kill their men, and they'll be begging for peace. They'll give us anything we want. The war will be over in a few months. They'll keep to themselves and will retain all conquered territories free from interference. And the Germans, Fuchida said, are pounding on the gates of Moscow. Genda moved in close to Fuchida. Our 1937 naval building program is complete. Japan has never been stronger, and America has never been weaker. This is our one great chance. Success will guarantee our free reign in the Pacific. Fuchida studied Genda's impassioned face for a moment, then turned back to the map, his eyes fixed on Oahu. So success at Pearl Harbor is the key then, isn't it? That's the key. Fuchida stood gazing at the map. Yamamoto's pushing in all his poker chips on this one, isn't he? We all are. He said that nothing less than a fatal blow will do. Understand that Yamamoto insists that diplomatic negotiations continue, and that the strike force be fully prepared to turn back no matter what stage we're at, even if we're one day away from the attack. Fuchida knew as well as Genda that negotiations between diplomats in Japan and Washington were little more than window dressing to justify the expansion of the war. The diplomats may have captured the front pages of the newspapers, but in reality they had become irrelevant. The Emperor's cabinet of war hawks was driving off any doves, and they felt that whatever they had the power to take, they had the right to take as well. Fuchida looked over the newly arranged map and took a deep breath. The negligence and arrogance of the Americans will be their undoing. If they're asleep, they deserve to be defeated. A grin took over Fuchida's face as he turned to face Genda. I was born a boy at the right time. Genda smiled back. So was I. October 1941. High Desert Bombing Range, Washington. A twin-engine light bomber roared past in the open sky. Inside the Douglas A-20, Jake sat motionless, peering through the bomb sight with his hands twisting control dials, oblivious to the deafening drone of the engines. The instructor hunched over him with a hand gripping the fuselage frame, the other holding a stopwatch. He yelled over the din of the engines. "What altitude did you dial in?" Jake yelled back without moving. 5,300 feet, sir. To become a bombardier, Jake studied long and hard to pass complex exams focalizing on math, his favourite subject. It felt nice to know he was finally good at something. This was certainly more interesting than handing off tools to a mechanic or raising domestic fowl. True airspeed? 220 knots, sir. When the target comes into view, release your payload just a half-second early to compensate for rack lag. Hit the outside second ring and I'll buy you a beer. Don't worry, it takes a while to get the feel of it all. Okay, I see it coming up. Okay, there it is. Bombs away. The instructor clicked his timer and stared at the dial. Jake looked up at his face, waiting. On the ground, a spotter in a small tower watched the chalk target through binoculars. Seeing a small puff of smoke, he grabbed the radio. That's a hit, sir. Inside the first ring. The instructor reached his hand up to his headset. The first ring? Copy that. He shook his head. You got me for 2 beers, Jake. You're killing me. Jake did his best to hide his glowing smirk, but failed. October 1941. Central Philippine University, Iloilo City. Two students in all white slung a baseball back and forth on the campus yard in front of several stucco two-story buildings, also white, with beige awnings over the windows. Tall coconut palms accented the campus, surrounded by dense tropical foliage. In 1901, a donation of $2,000 from John D. Rockefeller to the Baptist Church in the Philippines was enough to found a Bible college, which later became Central Philippine University, a small school with a growing reputation. Standing before a blackboard full of scrawled notes, Jimmy in his white suit adjusted his round-rimmed glasses and held up his index finger as the class of 18 students filed past him toward the door. "The quiz will cover the timeline of the kings of Israel and Judah, Tuesday." Frank Rose, the school president, a man with distinct blue eyes and topped with a head of thick white hair, stood just inside the doorway and tapping a folded newspaper onto his open palm, waiting for the tide of students to flow past. Walking up to Jimmy, he plopped the open newspaper onto his desk. "Is it any wonder enrollment is down? Way down?" Jimmy read the headlines. "Philippines Rush Defense Effort. General MacArthur and staff of American officers train Filipino manpower." Jimmy studied the paper a moment and looked up, pushing back the wave of fear with his own strength of hope. Tapping the newspaper with his same pointing finger, he said, "The greatest concentration of American bombers anywhere in the world is right here in the Philippines." Jimmy was certain Frank knew it too, but he didn't seem to have any confidence. "MacArthur says we've got hundreds of aircraft here, thousands of American and Filipino troops, and we can easily repel any attack from the Japanese." Frank ignored Jimmy's bravado. "All the ROTC students and staff are on alert, and all able-bodied men are on notice. We need to start putting together some contingency plans." For Jimmy, it was only the same saber-rattling and jockeying he'd been putting up with for years. At least he kept telling himself that. "I have a hard time, a very hard time, believing the Japanese would ever try to invade the islands." He angrily snapped a rubber band around a bundle of papers. "And if they do?" Jimmy looked away, then back at Frank, and blinked a couple of times. By candlelight, Charmer rested in her stuffed chair, reading, while Jimmy sat in his rocker beside their boxy shortwave radio, broadcasting the Information Please news program from San Francisco. Blackouts had become mandatory 2 months earlier to shroud the cities in darkness, to make them more difficult bombing targets. Straining to hear through the crackle and sonic hum, Jimmy cocked his head toward the radio. Considering the recent movements reported by the War Department of the Japanese Army and Navy, particularly in the areas of China and Southeast Asia, the possibility of obtaining satisfactory results from negotiating with Japan is a fading hope, but US Ambassador Joseph Grew continues his unrelenting pursuit of a diplomatic solution to... Jimmy snapped off the radio and sat back and rocked, the creak of his chair the only sound in the room. He unconsciously stared into the distance and spoke as if to himself. In 1901, the future president of the YMCA, John Mott, said that America can send 10,000 missionaries to Japan now, or in 40 years they'll have to send 100,000 soldiers. Jimmy kept rocking. Charmer let her book down to her lap. That was exactly 40 years ago. He stopped rocking and turned to Charmer. "We need to think about getting off the island." The fear he'd held under the surface for so long was breaking through. "We need to make some plans." Relieved that Peggy was in college in upstate New York, and David and Alice were in boarding school with friends in San Francisco, his concern was shifting to the welfare of his and Charmer's lives. He glanced down at the cover of a worn Life magazine on the coffee table, displaying Emperor Hirohito proudly atop a white horse, saluting. Soon. October 1941. The aircraft carrier Akagi, Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Workers traversed the docks of Yokosuka, strewn with stacks of pipes and rings of cables and lined with rusty warehouses. A truss-style crane towered above the deck of the majestic carrier Akagi as she sat silently at the docks, her peaceful exterior giving no hint of the frenzy of activity within. In a planning room aboard the carrier, hazy with cigarette smoke, Fuchida stood with his arms folded near Genda, and a group of officers staring down at two large tables displaying perfect models, one of Oahu and the other of Pearl Harbor itself. He was amazed at the fine detail and accuracy of the replicas. Much had taken place in preparation already, yet he was also overwhelmed by the immense amount of planning and logistics facing him and the team. It still seemed like an impossible task. How could the entire combined fleet enter American waters and then launch hundreds of planes over hundreds of miles undetected all the way to Pearl Harbor? Surely, even if the fleet wasn't discovered, regular American patrol aircraft would discover them, and every American aircraft on the island would be sent into the air to attack them. Were they all out of their minds? Standing between Fuchida and Genda was Rear Admiral Kusaka, formerly Fuchida's chief aboard the Akagi. Genda has advised that to achieve a crushing blow to the American fleet, all possible resources should be combined for a massive aerial attack, like none ever attempted from the sea. Genda spoke up. If I may, Admiral, all 6 carriers will be employed and kept in a tight formation to allow the aircraft to group quickly. We should be able to put no fewer than 350 aircraft into action in 2 waves, and I recommend the attack be during daylight for maximum accuracy. We'll rely primarily on torpedoes to destroy the carriers and battleships. Fuchida's mind was working. He knew they were waiting to hear his experienced opinions. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, Commander-in-Chief of the 1st Air Fleet and the one with the primary responsibility for the entire operation, stood beside Fuchida. As a lifelong practitioner of kendo, the martial art of sword fighting with bamboo swords, he valued the careful assessment of an opponent before making a strike. He ran his hand over his balding head. "Lieutenant Fuchida, please be frank." Fuchida shook his head. "The models are excellent, but where are the placements of the American ships?" Genda nodded to an assistant who unrolled a map with the last known locations of all the ships in the harbour sketched in. "A torpedo attack is essential," Genda said. "It'll do far greater damage than aerial bombs." "What's the average depth of the harbour?" Another assistant spoke up, reading from papers. "Sir, the harbour's maximum depth is approximately 14 metres. He looked at Fuchida, fearfully awaiting his response. 14? He said in disbelief. "We don't have any aerial torpedoes that'll run that shallow. They'll stick straight in the mud." The commanders turned to Genda. "Do it anyway. We'll find a way to make it work," Genda said. Fuchida knew Genda well enough that sometimes his theories exceeded his practical knowledge, but set the concern aside for the present. He also knew they had brilliant engineers. "What about torpedo nets? I can't imagine the Americans won't have their nets up." Genda casually lit a cigarette. "You think the harbour's too shallow for torpedoes?" He looked Fuchida in the eyes. "The Americans think it's too shallow for torpedoes. Our reports show that they're not using nets. If they do, our first torpedoes will blow holes in them and we'll drop more torpedoes right down the same lines." Fuchida waved his hand over the map. "Many of the ships are double-berthed. Torpedoes can't reach the inside positions. Aerial bombs are the only option." "Dive bombers, then," Nagumo said. Again, Fuchida shook his head. "Dive bombers can penetrate their carrier decks, but their battleship armour is too heavy. Level bombers can do it, but we don't have aerial bombs powerful enough for the job." Genda leaned in. "I've given a lot of thought to this. What about the 16-inch armour-piercing shells used for the guns of our battleships? What if we added fins and fastened them to your planes? Couldn't you use them successfully?" Fuchida pondered. "That's never been done either, but I'll talk to the engineers." Things were adding up in Fuchida's mind. So many untested systems, so many untried plans. He'd seen in the past how his commanders made finely tuned plans based on every variable being in their favour. But one problem, and the plan unravelled like an old tatami mat. Ever cautious, Nagumo looked Fuchida in the face. "Is everything going to be okay?" Fuchida felt the eyes of all pressing into him. If there was ever a chance to call things off, or least call for a delay, now would be the time. His few seconds of hesitation felt like minutes. "I can't tell you at this time, sir. Everything depends on our training from now on." Nagumo nodded and glanced at Genda. "Very good. Very good. Get on with the training of the pilots, Fuchida, but not a word is to be mentioned about the objective. Complete secrecy must be maintained. None of the flyers are to know. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "I'm still concerned about detection." Nagumo sighed deeply. Fuchida rubbed his face. "If we can achieve surprise, total surprise, the Pacific Fleet will be a memory." Still, it was a very unlikely scenario to him. November 17th, 1941. Fuchida, the leading officers and all of the officer aviators of the First Air Fleet stood at ease in formation, clothed in their warmest coats on the windy deck of the Akagi under freezing skies. White patches of snow blotted the ground and the carrier deck. "Our opponent this time is not an easy one," Yamamoto said. The commander-in-chief of the combined fleet gave his final remarks to the men before the fleet departed to a staging point in Hitokapu Bay. Fuchida could see the concern in his eyes that came from experience in war. "Japan has faced many worthy opponents in her long history, but the United States is the most worthy of all. You must be prepared for great American resistance. Admiral Kimmel, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, is known to be far-sighted and aggressive, so we can't count on surprise. You may have to fight your way to the target." A gust of wind whistled through the wires of the control tower. "The success or failure of the operation of this unit taking the first step in this battle will influence the success or failure of the entire Pacific operation. I'm praying for the best effort from all of us, and for our success." Yamamoto took a long look across the faces of men. "We await the Emperor's decision." Fuchida was confident, but the chilling wind brought a chill of fear as he contemplated what they were getting into. Everything was in place, and it would be a do-or-die mission. There would be no middle ground for the outcome of the attack. Admiral Yamamoto turned to Vice Admiral Nagumo, shook his hand and nodded, then did the same with Rear Admiral Kusaka and Genda. Coming to Fuchida, he grasped his hand and looked him soberly in the face, the whipping of the wind through the ranks the only sound. If called upon, Fuchida knew he would be the lead warrior in an event that could change the course of Japan's future and perhaps the world itself. He was ready. November 26th, 1941. Just off the Kuril Islands, Japan. Under cover of night from a remote bay on one of the northernmost islands of Japan, the most powerful naval battle group that had ever been assembled set off eastward. Fuchida stood on the open flight deck of the Akagi in the dim starlight, his pant legs flapping in the wind, and took in the sight of the first air fleet of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 24 other support ships, cruisers, oilers, and destroyers. The ships were given colourful names such as Flying Dragon, Hiryu, Auspicious Crane, Zuikaku, and Red Castle, Akagi, the name of a dormant volcano and home to the legends of gods. He felt a personal closeness to the Akagi, the flagship of the fleet, like she was a long-trusted friend. Over the previous months he had shouted himself hoarse, working with groups of flyers, giving instructions and encouraging the men at every opportunity to strive for excellence. Now, with the frenzied training behind him, he enjoyed the cold sea breeze and the slow pitch and yaw of the ship. He inhaled with relief and excitement, and raised a sextant to make a sighting to determine the position of their vessel. As the atmosphere was quite clear, he immediately found the North Star, Polaris, that steady star he'd come to trust and love through the years. The multitude of stars in the night sky pulled his mind to the thousands of soldiers and hundreds of warships in motion all over Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and how it would be such a disappointment if they were called back to Japan after so much preparation. December 1st, 1941. The Imperial Palace, Tokyo, Japan. 19 leaders sat stiffly in the Imperial Council chamber with only Tojo standing, having just completed his last words to the Emperor. They all had spent countless hours over weeks and months discussing every conceivable plan and every possible outcome, and it had finally come down to this one electrically charged moment. All eyes were fixed on the Emperor, waiting nervously. Emperor Hirohito gently nodded his head. It would be war. December 8th, 1941, Japan. December 7th, USA, before the dawn. The Pacific Ocean, 300 miles north of Oahu, Hawaii. The carrier Akagi rose and fell on the high seas in the dark dawn, throwing great sheets of white water into the wind. Below decks, having just poured out his heart and soul to his fellow flyers, Fuchida, in his full flight gear, came face to face with Genda in the passageway. 18 years of friendship and life flashed before him as he looked at Genda. Danger or not, this was the course he had chosen, and, having received their orders, there would be no turning back. As planes rumbled outside and pilots shoved past them in the passageway, Fuchida's sober gaze at Genda grew into a smile. Genda smiled back. This would be the greatest day of their lives. On the flight deck, Fuchida approached his own green-grey Nakajima bomber with its distinctive red tail painted with 3 horizontal yellow bars across the rudder so his pilots could recognize him in the air. He affectionately ran his hand across the leading edge of the wing, like a samurai examining his katana 6. Smiling, he turned to his engineer, Kanegasaki, a man taller than the rest, and shouted over the deafening engines, asking a clearly rhetorical question. "Is my aircraft in order?" He bowed ahead with a quick nod. "Sharpened to a keen edge, sir." Despite the urgency of the moment, Kanegasaki, surrounded by several other engineers in white, withdrew a long white bandana from his pocket and held it in outstretched hands to Fuchida. "All of the maintenance crew would like to go with you to Pearl Harbor. Since we can't, we want you to take this hachimaki as a symbol that we are with you in spirit." The crew gave a brief bow, as Fuchida did likewise. He respectfully accepted the hachimaki with both hands and quickly tied it around his leather helmet, samurai style. He gave Kanegasaki a quick smile, then clambered up the wing and into the center position of his aircraft. The plane seated 3 men. In the front was Fuchida's pilot. In the middle sat Fuchida as bombardier, and in the rear seat was his radio operator gunner. As leader of the entire flight operation, Fuchida had far more to focus on than flying, as he was responsible for directing the pilots, as well as documenting the progress of the entire raid for later review. He also had the responsibility of aiming and delivering their precious 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, the ultimate purpose of his aircraft. After strapping in, he reached back with both hands and slid the canopy shut as his pilot wound up the engine and taxied into takeoff position. Fuchida had accumulated over 3,000 hours in the air without a major incident, but he was well aware that even the slightest problem with his aircraft over the open ocean could mean death. Flying into hostile air and coming under fire greatly increased the risk, and their estimates had put the acceptable loss at nearly half their 414 aircraft. He and his companions would be in the air for nearly 8 hours, where anything could happen. But Fuchida quashed the thoughts, as there was no sense being concerned about what couldn't be changed. The successful execution of the attack was all he cared about now. Nothing else. With the flagman's okay, the plane throttled up, pressed him back into his seat, and roared down the wooden runway. As they cleared the end and lifted into the dark dawn sky, Fuchida was once again filled with a childlike elation and thrilled to see other aircraft circling and forming into their respective flight groups. Once the 6 carriers had sent aloft the first wave of 183 planes, and they were properly grouped, they headed south to Oahu. As Fuchida reviewed his plans, something caught his eye. Under the orange morning sky, the rising sun on the horizon beamed rays of sunlight through the clouds. Excitedly, he pushed back his canopy and waved both hands in the air to his comrades, his hachimaki trailing in the wind, and pointed to the sun. Nearby flyers likewise pushed back their canopies and waved with enthusiasm. He was certain the gods were with them. 25 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Kota Bharu, Malaya, 350 miles northwest from the British stronghold of Singapore. Japanese destroyers pummeled the shore positions with barrages of artillery shells, their guns firing with ferocity, piercing the dark morning horizon with brilliant flashes of light. 4 columns of troop transports loaded with 5,300 infantry soldiers flooded the northern beaches at Kota Bharu and came under heavy small arms fire from the British, Indian and Australian forces. They were the first Japanese infantry of tens of thousands to follow in the invasion of Malaya on their way to seize Singapore, the centre of British strength in Southeast Asia. 5 minutes before the attack, Oahu, Hawaii. Flying through the tropical volcanic mountains of Oahu, Fuchida was stunned that they had apparently remained undetected all the way to their destination. He looked above and around his group of aircraft in disbelief. Not a single patrol plane on watch. Fuchida scanned his map, then looked through his binoculars to the landscape below. There were the ships in the harbour, just like the model they had built. Quickly shoving back the canopy, he fired a single Black Dragon signal flare into the morning sky, signalling for the entire squadron to plunge into attack. His B-5N, a high-level bomber, climbed as the torpedo bombers dropped lower. As the various planes took their well-rehearsed positions, beginning their approach to assault the American fleet, Fuchida realized that they had done it. They had beaten all the odds and caught their prey completely unaware. With exhilaration, pulled his speaker tube to his face and called out to his radio man, "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger!" His radio man quickly tapped out the code back to the main fleet, signifying their achievement of complete surprise on the enemy. Back at the Akagi, Fuchida's engineer, Kanegasaki with the others in the empty hangar section, stood below a PA speaker, listening keenly. "Attention, attention. Commander Fuchida has reported back from Hawaii the following message. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." The crew of the entire ship burst into ecstatic cheers and shouts of euphoria. In his office at the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito, somewhat bleary-eyed, having stayed up anxiously through the night, sat upright at his desk with 4 other nervous and tired officials seated in his office of red velvet and wooden chairs. A messenger came to the door, bowed, and entered. "Your Majesty, we have just received this communication from the Combined Fleet." He stepped to the Emperor's desk and held out a note in outstretched arms with his head bowed. The Emperor took the note gingerly, apprehensively scanned his eyes over the message, sighed, nodded, and smiled. "Commander Fuchida sends this message." He paused for effect. "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." The officials beamed with relief and vigorously shook each other's hands. "Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii. 3:08 a.m. Japanese Standard Time, December 8. 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian Time, December 7. Fuchida brought his group into their bombing run toward Battleship Row and watched as dive bombers fell from the sky onto Hickam Field, the Army air base near the mouth of Pearl Harbor, dropping their payload onto tightly packed groups of parked aircraft. Zero fighters tore through the rows of planes in a spectacular display of explosions and flames. He knew that this was perhaps the most crucial part of their plan, for if Hickam's B-17s and P-40s managed to take to the air and follow the Japanese back to their own fleet, it could prove disastrous. Closing into the harbour like predators stalking their unaware prey, Fuchida watched the torpedo bombers make their final approaches, each pilot on his own highly planned course. As the drone of the engines approached the idle ships, torpedoes splashed into the ocean and swam silently to their targets as the next planes fell into position behind them. Dozens of torpedoes sped toward the moored ships. Two half-dressed American sailors at the rail of the battleship USS West Virginia stared in amazement. "What the hell?" Two massive concussions exploded columns of water 100 feet into the air. A rapid succession of blasts rocked battleship after battleship, one after another, which began filling the air with thick plumes of black smoke. Anti-aircraft fire began to pock the sky with black smoke blossoms as waves of Val dive bombers screamed down on the fleet, releasing their 250-pound payloads with merciless precision. Fuchida looked down through binoculars, assessing the organized chaos, while his pilot took a pass over the ship they were targeting. He cursed under his breath. He could see no carriers, which was just as their last report had indicated, and was forced to release his distant hope. Just as he finished counting the 7 battleships in the harbour, an anti-aircraft shell exploded on their left, violently shaking their plane. His pilot, Lieutenant Matsuzuki, checked his instruments and spoke to Fuchida through the speaker tube hanging from his neck. "Don't worry about that. We're all right, sir." A second shell burst even closer on the right, convulsing the plane and sending bits of shrapnel through the aircraft. Everything having gone so well so far, Fuchida wanted to get on with their business and hopefully make it back to their carrier alive. "Let's get a good sighting. Drop this bomb, then circle out wider," he ordered. The pilot nodded and started his level bombing run over the battleships as Fuchida's group of 5 bombers formed into their tight V formation, just like they'd practiced dozens of times before. Taking aim through his bomb sight at his target through the growing clouds of smoke, he waited until the exact moment, then released his 1,660-pound armour-piercing bomb onto USS Maryland below. With the many planes dropping so many bombs, he couldn't tell which of the planes in his group hit the target, but could see 2 explosions on the ship below and knew their group had accomplished their goal. His plane shuddered violently from another hellacious explosion, this one from the harbour far below. As he looked down, a phenomenal red fireball shrouded in smoke rose hundreds of feet skyward from a battleship. He grinned and nodded. It was the telltale mark of a direct hit on the powder magazine. His airmen were performing terrifically, and the Americans were foolish to leave their fleet completely unprotected. Fuchida's plane banked away as he stared at the ships below, collapsing into the water under a heavy veil of smoke. The mission was unfolding as an astounding success. His heart blazed with joy. 10:50 a.m. Pacific Time, McCord Field, Tacoma, Washington. An olive-green fuel truck rumbled past an open hangar housing 4 B-17 bombers. Inside the mess hall kitchen, Jake sat peeling potatoes, huddled with 5 others in white aprons, listening to the Giants-Dodgers football game booming over the radio. "Are you crazy?" Jake said. "Tuffy Lehman's is a freight train when they hand him the ball. He's going to take the Giants to the playoffs. Again." Jake lobbed his peeled potato into an aluminum tub and grabbed another. "The Giants didn't make the playoffs last year, idiot," another piped in. "Tuffy couldn't pull a caboose compared to Pug Manders, Brooklyn's 2-time Pro Bowl fullback who averaged over 40 yards a game." "Wise guy," Jake answered. "The Giants made the playoffs in 38 and 39, and Tuffy's averaging 47 yards a game. And you probably didn't know that today is Tuffy Lehman's day at the ballpark. You got a Pug Manders day. No, of course you don't." The crew stopped at the sound of a commotion rumbling from behind a pair of double doors, which burst open as airmen flew in. "The Japs hit Pearl! The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor! They're all over Hawaii!" Jake leapt up and hurled a potato against the wall. "You Jap bastards are going to pay for this. No one does that to the USA and gets away with it. No one!" 2:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Keuka College outside Rochester, New York. An American flag flapped atop the flagpole over the vacant college campus. In a small staff break room, female students and teachers packed together and overflowed into the hallway, listening frozen to a radio report. Some stifled sobs and held handkerchiefs to their faces. Peggy listened stoically near the window. She had long feared and half expected to hear something like this. The radio announcer continued. There's chaos on Oahu and great loss of life as information continues to come in on the Japanese attack. The American fleet at Pearl Harbor is completely engulfed in smoke and flames, and there are now reports of a full-scale invasion by the Japanese. American troops are being put on alert as "Oh God! Oh God, no!" one of the girls blurted out as she broke down in uncontrollable sobs. Peggy turned to the window as a chill shot over her skin. She stared out and spoke under her breath. Dad. The Japanese would be coming to the Philippines. Just past noon, the aircraft carrier Akagi. Fuchida's plane touched down into the arresting cables and jolted to a stop, the very last plane back from both attack waves. Fuchida had taken it on himself to make sure no stragglers were left behind and the skies were clear. Genda approached the plane as Fuchida struggled out and stretched his arms and legs, then dropped to the deck. "How many did we lose?" Fuchida asked. "Still waiting on the other reports, but it looks to be about 30. Fuchida paused, wondering which of his men were killed, then loosened the hachimaki from his head, pulled off his sweaty cap and goggles, and began unbuckling his parachute harness as they walked toward the tower. "That's it. I'm the last one." In front of a briefing room full of exhausted airmen, Fuchida carefully drew marks of hits on a blackboard showing the harbour. Ships were labelled A, B, C, and so on, with long arrows showing torpedo strikers with X's marking aerial bombing hits. Fuchida looked over his shoulder. "Shirikata?" A pilot stood up and smartly bowed his head. "Sir, successful torpedo strike on Colorado-class battleship, position D." As Fuchida chalked a line up to the ship, Kanegasaki, Fuchida's mechanic, appeared at the doorway, wiping grease from his hands, and gave a quick bow. "Please excuse me, Commander, but I thought you should see this. It's important." Slightly perturbed, Fuchida glanced up at Kanegasaki, then turned to the pilots. "Remain as you are. I will return shortly." He followed his engineer down the stairs to the upper flight deck, where mechanics and engineers were making quick repairs and rearming and refueling the aircraft. In the event the fleet came under attack, or if the American carriers were found close enough for a strike, they had to be ready. Fuchida didn't like being taken away in the middle of debriefing, but knew his personal engineer wouldn't have called him for something insignificant. Kanegasaki ran his hand over the wing of Fuchida's plane, then pressed his fingers into a hole. "Here are the hits from the anti-aircraft fire that struck your plane with shrapnel. If any had struck your fuel tank, of course you wouldn't be standing here. I counted 21 holes from the American flak, including this." He leaned down and lifted a small hatch, revealing a half-frayed control cable in the fuselage, barely hanging by a thread, and tugged it with his finger. "Your elevator cable." Fuchida knew that the loss of it would have resulted in the immediate destruction of his aircraft. Kanegasaki stood upright and looked soberly at Fuchida for a moment, then broke into a smile. "Commander, the gods smile on you." December 7th, 3 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, McCord Field, Tacoma, Washington. Jake clenched the phone to his face inside the glass and wood phone booth, one of many along a wall in a room packed with cursing soldiers. With one hand covering his ear, he shouted into the receiver, "I'm telling you, Ma, I said, I'm telling you, those little Japs are going to wish they'd never done what they did." Jake's mum stood in the kitchen in her apron, smudges of flour on her face and hands, clenching the phone with both hands. Helen winced as Mr. Andrus watched and listened with his arms folded. "Now, son, We're all upset about this, but you mustn't— Don't tell me. Let's see. God tells us to forgive our enemies, but he burns all is up. Do I have it right, Ma? Well, do I? Jake's mother looked over to her husband. She spoke gently but firmly. Well, son, you know I'm all right with war. After all, David killed Goliath, but hatred will— As far as I'm concerned, I'd be happy if we wiped every last Jap off the face of the earth. They want a fight? Well, now they got one. Jake slammed the receiver down and struggled to push the folding glass door open as another fuming soldier squeezed to get in. 5 hours after the attack, Central Philippines University. Jimmy stood in Frank's office in his bare feet, his shirt half untucked and his hair a bit wild. The sun was peeking over the mountains through the windows. There's nothing as stupid as war. He jerked his head around and paced to the wall and back. Well, we shouldn't let this setback change what we need to do here, at all. I say we stay the course and keep classes open. If the Japanese invade, MacArthur'll push 'em back off the islands, and then we can get on with business. Well? Frank stood up from his desk, walked over to a globe, and gave it a light spin. We'll give it a try and see how things go. The territory of Hawaii? Pearl Harbor? What were they thinking? Jimmy squinted into the unwelcome daylight. Listen, Jimmy, I'll do what I can to run the university business as usual, but you need to be ready for anything. Jimmy turned back as the globe slowly come to a stop, then rested his hand on it like the head of child and spoke softer. I just can't believe they've done this. 6 hours after the attack, Kai Tak Airport, Hong Kong. One after another, 34 Kai-32 light bombers released their explosives onto the British aircraft below, obliterating the few planes were on the ground, followed by Kai-97 fighters who decimated what was left in an endless barrage of bullets. On the outskirts of the city, 40,000 Japanese troops with heavy artillery amassed to overwhelm the island city. 6 hours after the attack, Tokyo, Japan. Kneeling beside a radio on a low table, Fuchida's wife, Haruko, and their 2 children listened to the announcement. Being forced to cross swords with the Americans against our will, our airmen made a daring attack this morning in a dazzling victory for His Majesty the Emperor. In our efforts to stabilize East Asia and to defend our empire against Western aggression, our warriors. Children, they're talking about your father. He is a great man. Yoshia, their son of 8, looked up to his mother and smiled. 8 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Clark Air Base, about 40 miles northwest of Manila, Philippines. Hey, not so fast. 1 American cigarette equals 3 Filipino cigarettes. Or vice versa, get it? You calling or raising? Under the shade of an enormous hangar, 3 aircraft mechanics played a fast game of poker on shipping crates while finishing ham sandwiches and Coca-Cola. The smooth harmonies of Chattanooga Choo Choo echoed over the radio. Behind them, engineers wheeled bombs under the open bomb bay doors of 2 B-17s. The first mechanic studied his hand and raised an eyebrow to a second who rolled his eyes. The first pushed in 6 Filipino cigarettes. I'm seeing ya. Beside the runway outside, a pilot sat eating a sandwich in the cockpit of his parked fighter. The base was surrounded by open fields of razor-sharp Kogon grass and housed a row of hangars, home to 24 P-40 fighters, 10 B-18 medium bombers, and 19 B-17 heavy bombers. The base was on alert, and every aircraft was getting fueled up and loaded with weapons for a counterstrike on Formosa, occupied by Japan and a key base for several divisions of attack aircraft. One of the engineers behind the poker players in the hangar yelled out, "Hey, we ain't got all day. We got some special delivery for the Japs coming up. You better be ready." Yeah, keep your shirt on." The first player snapped his hand of cards shut and grabbed a swig of Coke. Midway through the song, an announcer broke in over the radio. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this bulletin. Japanese bombers have been sighted attacking Clark Air Base. I repeat, Japanese bombers have... "Hey, fellas! That's us!" the second player blurted out. The first player discarded as the third player dealt him 2 cards without a flinch. "Hey, genius! If we were under attack, don't you think we'd know about it? We've got 150,000 boots on the ground and bases loaded with bombers. The Japs aren't so stupid that..." Everyone in the hangar froze and looked up as they began to hear the distant whistling of falling bombs. Outside, the air raid siren began to howl. The plane behind them exploded with a thunderous blast. A succession of bombs burst down the runway and hangars, shaking the ground with bone-rattling concussions, blowing parked planes to bits and igniting a fuel depot into an inferno of flames. Men scattered across the taxiways and grass shoulders, diving into ditches as 46 Type 96 twin-engine bombers pounded the base, and 34 Zero fighters followed by strafing the leftovers. A few soldiers on the ground struggled to load anti-aircraft guns, none of which had ever been fired before or even tested. Prepared for a tough fight, the Japanese never imagined such a pathetic lack of opposition. December 10th, 1941. The Imperial Palace. Wearing a dark grey overcoat in the cool morning, Emperor Hirohito moved along slowly on a covered wooden walkway, observing his gardens, his hands behind his back. An attendant in black, a few steps behind, read to him the morning paper. The Hawaiian debacle and the sweeping victories being scored by the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy forces on all fronts have swept away a good deal of the braggadocio spirit of the American people. Only a few weeks ago they were boasting that the United States could finish off Japan in 3 months. The Emperor stopped, reached for a branch and bent it down, snapping off a small dead twig. Today these same Americans are trembling in their shoes, and they have every reason for doing so. The British will soon be cursing Roosevelt as "that blasted idiot." We hate to think what his own people will be calling the would-be Lord High Protector of the universe when they awaken to the full realization of what he got them into. Once the boast of America and the envy of decrepit Britannia, the Pacific Fleet has vanished from the seas, while only a few battered hulks remain. With her battle fleet annihilated in the most humiliating disaster in all history, the United States has been reduced at one stroke to a third-rate naval power. The attendant folded the paper to display a political cartoon and bowed, handing it with both hands to the Emperor. Hirohito took the paper and examined the cartoon, which displayed a huge, powerful fist labelled Japan, punching down 3 distraught figures grasping an oversized rifle: Uncle Sam of America, John Bull of Great Britain, and Chiang Kai-shek of China, all falling backwards. Hirohito looked up at the attendant with a smile and handed the paper back, pleased to see cartoons mocking the Americans instead of the other way around, turned to look at his gardens of rocks, bushes and trees, and breathed in the fresh air. Such a beautiful day. December 23rd, 1941. Kanoya Air Base. Fuchida breathed with relief as he flew his plane back to his airbase from the Akagi. It had been a long and treacherous journey for the fleet back into their home waters. First, they were on constant watch for a reprisal strike from the American carriers, none of which were in Pearl Harbor during the attack. They had to refuel again on the seas and feared submarines throughout the journey. They also encountered a severe storm that swept some men to their deaths. But now he was at ease with the mission behind him, more successful than anyone had ever imagined. There was no announcement to the public of the return of the pilots from the carrier to the base, but as planes began appearing and word trickled out, more and more of the townspeople rushed to catch a glimpse of their triumphant warriors. Normally off-limits to the public, the base made an exception for the jubilant crowds to catch a glimpse of their national heroes. By the time Fuchida arrived, the last one from his group, he could see a large mass of waving citizens near the hangars and parked aircraft. In the months leading up, some of the townspeople had been annoyed by the constant flight training over their city. Now that they understood why, they were overjoyed. After taxiing beside the crowd, cutting his engine and throwing back his canopy, he was greeted with a surge of wild cheering, pushing his goggles up and jumping down to the tarmac as the mayor of Kagoshima City, in his black suit and top hat, stepped forward, bowed, and shook Fuchida's hand vigorously. He watched with delight as parents brought their children who pressed around Fuchida. A young lady with a breathtaking smile presented a bouquet of flowers to him, who admired her just a bit too long. He let himself drink in the victor's wine. With the bouquet in one hand, he raised the other and signalled for quiet. He shouted so all could hear. "Thank you for your wonderful welcome. I'm sorry, but for security reasons, I cannot give you an account of our operation." The crowd burst into cheering that slowly dissolved into a chant of "Fuchida, Fuchida, Fuchida." He smiled with a nod, then gave another admiring look at the young lady. That evening, over a sumptuous dinner of Thai, a fish usually reserved for New Year's or a wedding celebration, Fuchida and other officers laughed, recounted stories, and indulged in the beer and sake of champion warriors. The next afternoon, he and Shigeharu Murata, Japan's undisputed torpedo ace, were called up to Tokyo for a luncheon with the Chief of the Naval General Staff, Vice Admiral Osami Nagano, along with many of his top officers, Admiral Yamamoto with his own Chief of Staff, and Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki as well, his cadre of officers. Fuchida was amazed by the praise poured out on him. He and Murata were given the seats of honour at the head of the table, where each admiral, in order of rank from the highest, passed his sake cup to the two heroes in congratulations and the applause of the usually subdued group of distinguished officers. Standing and raising his white-gloved hand, Admiral Yamamoto motioned for quiet and opened a vertical scroll painted with Shodo calligraphy known as a kakejiku. "On the very day of the strike, I felt inspired to write this for you," he said to Fuchida. "The Hono nearly petrified Fuchida." Yamamoto delivered his poem with feeling. "Message of attack reaches my ears from more than 3,000 miles away, a message from Hawaii. Thinking of Flight Leader Fuchida's brilliant action on the early morning of 8 December, so writes Isoroku Yamamoto." The group broke into applause and cheers as Yamamoto rolled up the kakejiku and handed it to Fuchida in outstretched arms and a bow. Fuchida had never been so honoured in his entire life, nor had he ever imagined he would be. He bowed and received the prized gift from the leader he most admired in the entire Imperial Navy. As the men continued their strong applause, just when Fuchida thought things couldn't possibly get any better, Yamamoto leaned close to him and whispered, "The Emperor requests an audience with you as well." The sun had risen on Fuchida, December 26, 1941, the Imperial Palace. In a small, square Imperial briefing room, Fuchida sat uncomfortably stiff in a meticulously carved chair before the Emperor. Unmoving, he glanced around the room at Vice Admiral Nagano, Chief of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff, Commander Shimazaki, the leader of the second wave of aircraft in the Pearl Harbor attack, and Vice Admiral Nagumo, Commander-in-Chief of the First Air Fleet, who was standing finishing his remarks. All were in their full-dress uniforms with braids and medals, including the Emperor, seated in his chair on a raised platform. A large, low table sat in the centre, neatly arranged with charts, maps, and glossy aerial photographs of the Pearl Harbor mission. Such power in this small room, he thought. The sweet aroma of incense continued to drift through the air from a blue Celadon censer that had been paraded through the room earlier by an imperial aide. Fuchida had always thought himself a strong person, and his recent exploits only boosted that sentiment. But now he found his heart trembling and his fingers twitching as he sat before the Emperor of Japan, the leader whom the entire nation served as one man. Nagumo continued his explanation. The auspicious weather, the enemy's failure to detect the task force, The clouds that first hid the attack then miraculously parted at the perfect moment. Such a combination of circumstances was proof of divine power through the instrument of the Emperor. Nagumo bowed deeply and took his seat. The Emperor turned his head to Fuchida. An aide nodded to Fuchida, who rose, bowed deeply, took a breath to compose himself, and began his explanation of the attack using the photos and drawings of the placement of American ships in the harbour. The air was one of complete seriousness, not jubilation as the night before. As he neared the end of his presentation, the Emperor said, "We note that 15 enemy planes were shot down. Were any of these civilian planes?" "Your Majesty, 3 or 4 aircraft hit were unarmed training planes. 1 green aircraft was shot down, which might have been civilian." "I hope it wasn't." The Emperor looked down for a moment. "What was the initial reaction of the Americans?" 2 minutes after our first bombs were dropped, we received heavy anti-aircraft fire. In truth, we were surprised the Americans could respond so quickly. The Emperor shuffled the large photographs in his hands, carefully examining each one. "Was any damage inflicted other than on ships, planes, and airfields?" "The airmen were careful to strike only military targets." The Emperor nodded to him in such a way that Fuchida knew his presentation time was concluded. Fuchida bowed deeply and returned to his seat.